all so much for joining us today for our UUCD forum lineup. Today we are featuring the Tamarack Water Alliance, and the presentation is going to be Risks of High Sulfide Mining in Tamarack. We're going to be joined by Tom Anderson, MSEE, who will present regarding the risks the proposed Talon Metals and Rio Tinto high sulfide mine poses to northeastern Minnesota and potentially the Twin Cities and Lake Superior. Anytime a high sulfide mine has been built in a water-rich environment like ours, it has always contaminated the water and surrounding environment. Talon Metals and Rio Tinto is a foreign-owned entity, and in addition, we have prime wild rice lakes in our county, sacred to the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe people, and whose rights to hunt, fish, and gather are protected by the 1855 treaty. There is also concern about the high sulfide particulates or particles the mine vents would blow into the air with inadequate filters, and where they plan to put all of the wastewater. Will it be treated? We're going to learn more today from Tom, and for those listening in later, we are also highlighting the website tamarackwateralliance.org, where you can learn more about this and their grassroots organization. Let's give a big round of applause to Tom and Alan again for joining us this morning. A great forum. Tom, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. How's that? Yeah, just wanted to take a couple of minutes to describe a trip that I was on in February to Serbia. We went over there to get a firsthand look at the doings of mining giant Rio Tinto, partner in the Tamarack nickel project. Rio Tinto, I think, is the world's second largest mining company. And the gist of it is that Rio Tinto has a pretty bad reputation, and they deserve that reputation in no uncertain terms. There's an article out there right now describing their legacy in New Guinea, which is truly terrible. But what we saw in Serbia, where the story of Serbia is that there is a lithium deposit in Western Serbia that Rio Tinto has their sights on. Enormous protests took place in 2022, which the ruling regime of Serbia canceled the leases for the mines, arguably to tip the election in their favor. And it will not surprise you to hear that Rio Tinto did not leave Serbia, but instead stuck around and has been spreading millions of euros all over the place to curry influence. And so what we witnessed going out to Western Serbia is a village called Gornje Nedice, which has been forcibly depopulated. So Rio Tinto was out there aggressively buying up housing stock, and people are paid 2 and 3 times what those houses are worth, and you get a bonus if you take the roof off and kick the windows out, because that allows them to put up a sign that says that the property is unstable. So what you see then is an entire village that looks like a war zone, and where some people have a large number of people have left, but the people who remain are adamant about not supporting a mine. They would view that as grinding up the bones of their ancestors. So these are people who have lived in this area for nine generations or more. And so I would encourage you to just go to Google and read about what Rio Tinto is doing in Serbia. I mean, the obvious connection for us is that it is not recommended to let Rio Tinto start nickel mining in Minnesota. And one thing that I observed recently is, and again, Serbia is beset with enormous protests because the mine has now been reopened. ruling regime. Is one thing the Rio Tinto has done is they are now moving the different pieces of their mine plan as though they were separate projects. So they're deliberately trying to downplay the impact of their mine by saying that the mine and the waste facility and the processing facility are all different projects. And that's quite an underhanded thing to do. It's very typical. And I would say a corollary that we potentially face here in Minnesota is that it's Talon Metals' intention to receive a permit to mine a very small piece of what is otherwise a pretty expansive deposit. And if they can do that, we know it's their intention to mine much more of that. And so they're telling their investors they intend to put in a mining district. But if they get a permit for a small piece of that deposit, it will then allow them to expand in the future, doing as little environmental review as possible. So that's what we're seeking to avoid. And with that, let's give it to Tom Anderson to tell us more about this Tamarack nickel project.
Thank you, everyone. First, I wanted to talk about high sulfide mining because we use the term relative to many mines, but it requires some background, I think, for you to fully appreciate what this means. Because up in the boundary waters, the whole copper thing with Glencore, et cetera, and Polymet, that's all high sulfide mining as well. So this is just useful in general for your information when you're thinking about these mines. Now, sulfur itself, and we're talking about high sulfide mines, but sulfur itself is, and it's quite common. This particular map here is a map of the US. It's produced by the USGS, I believe, or a government organization. And you can see it's color coded. Now, the red part, because you probably can't read it, I can't read it very well, but it's up to like 2.5% by weight sulfur. 2.5%, that's a good amount of sulfur just laying around, because this is ground sulfur. It's within 2 inches of the topsoil. So the top 2 inches of topsoil shows the sulfur. And you can see up in the range area is red, and primarily because there is sulfur, the taconite mining is also mining sulfur in those taconite ores, but it's not necessarily high sulfide. It still has a negative impact, we'll see, from the taconite mining, but it's not nearly as bad as a high sulfide mine. Now, sulfur is essential. You probably, if you have blueberries, you've probably gone to Menards and bought a little pack of sulfur to acidify the soil by the blueberries, because blueberries like, you know, acidic soil. So it's an essential nutrient. Now, there's not much sulfur in that fertilizer, but there's a lot of sulfur compounds that are highly toxic. Carbon disulfide is, hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is the stuff that smells like rotten eggs. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. Well, you get low concentration where you can actually smell eggs. That's slightly toxic, but isn't very harmful if you're not living in it. But higher concentrations, and it doesn't have to be that high, which I'll show you in the next slide, to become poisonous. You have sulfur dioxide, and of course, sulfuric acid, which is one of the major fallouts of a high sulfide mine, is that the sulfur, when it is unearthed and then comes in contact with air, oxygen, and water, hydrogen and oxygen, creates sulfuric acid. And that was actually the big deal with all the coal burning plants. The high sulfur coal burned the coal, released the sulfur into the atmosphere in the form of gas, came down as sulfuric acid and nitric acid, because there was some nitrogen compounds in there, and you know, really messed up large areas of forest and other things. So this is all the same kind of thing. Generally, extractive industries like petroleum, natural gas, as well as mining, including coal and whole other mines, usually have a good amount of sulfur associated with it. In fact, if you're in the gas and oil business, you know that hydrogen sulfide, that's the rotten egg substance, is there and evident often when you're drilling for oil. And actually you have to be careful, because if it comes down to high concentrations, it can be very toxic. So drillers of petroleum products are well aware of this. From a toxicity perspective, usually exposure is less than 20 parts per million. 20 parts per million are okay. When you get up to 100 parts per million, the neurotoxicity of the hydrogen sulfide is such that it actually damages the olfactory. It's even worse because you can go into a very toxic sulfur dioxide environment and you don't smell it anymore. Bad news. Now, coal is typically 0.2 to 5% sulfur. When we're talking about these high sulfide mines, they're like 5 to 7, maybe higher percent sulfur. So they're worse, typically worse than the worst coal that we were burning that caused acid mine rain across such large regions around those coal-fired power plants. Now, there's also the issue of nitrogen, various oxides of nitrogen as well. And those are also produced certainly in coal, but you see them in mining because the dynamite used creates a great deal of various nitrogen oxide gases. So the blasting underground, particularly the Tamarack mine is underground mine, all that blasting creates a lot of concentrated nitrogen oxides, which cause the same kind of problem. Now, as I said, even the iron ore in the range, the taconite mines also contain sulfur. And those you can see, and I think let me just jump to the next page. Those you can see, particularly around the Birch Lake area. The Birch Lake was recently classified as impaired due to the runoff from the sulfur deposits of the tailings from taconite. So this is in the Dunca region, and several lakes in the Boundary Waters Canoe area on the edge are contaminated with sulfates. And there's a lot of negative impacts, other impacts that we'll talk about. And one of those is that when these sulfates get into the ecosystem, particularly the organic ecosystem, it combines with mercury or to create a more toxic form of mercury that's naturally in the soil called methyl mercury, which is also known to be a neurotoxin. And that's one of the reasons the mercury release is one of the reasons why you shouldn't be eating fish out of that area of the boundary waters. Let me go back up here. So of particular concern for us are the harsh sulfide concentrations in the Minnesota copper and nickel deposits, of which there are quite a few. And you've heard about the Glencore ones and Polymet, all that stuff up north in the range. But around Tamarack area, and the Tamarack proposed mine is about 60 miles kind of straight west of here. It's like if you've driven 210, it's very close to 210 near McGregor, Tamarack, right? Cromwell, that whole line. But it's just north a few miles of Tamarack off of 210. And that's a proposed underground mine. And as Talon alluded to, it's 51% owned by Talon Metals, which is a little startup, a minor or a junior as they call it, but 49% owned by Rio Tinto. So in that way, Talon takes the lead on all the stuff, and who's ever heard of Talon? It was really created for this purpose. And so there's no negative implications. But Rio Tinto was the 49% owner. And that was done on purpose, as Alan mentioned, rather than Rio Tinto coming in, which sounds terrible. They have Talon leading the way, which doesn't sound as bad, but it's the same effect. Now, let's see. I talked about the methyl mercury aspect, but that's, now these slides are available online. We can tell you where they are when we get to the booth, but if you go to the website that Brett talked about and go to the resources page, it's down in the resources, but the presentation is available for you to review in PDF form if you'd like to. Now, the issue with mercury is that the sulfite reducing bacteria as a result of the sulfates and produce a more toxic or a biotoxic form of mercury, and that's the methyl mercury that I referred to. And methyl mercury is just not good for nerves, particularly small children, babies, things like that. And that's why it's important when there's an impairment on a lake, don't eat the fish, certainly. Now, one of the biggest consequence maybe is the runoff of sulfur compounds that eventually form into sulfuric acid, because as I mentioned, when the sulfur itself, elemental sulfur, comes in contact with air and water, you form sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid, here's sulfuric acid on the right-hand side here. It is O2, that's water, and oxygen, air. So that sulfuric acid usually takes a while to form because it's a slow chemical reaction to form sulfuric acid. And often it's hundreds of years. But once it's there, it can take thousands of years to, recover itself. And that's why we have a lot of the negative impacts of sulfide mining only showing up years later, 10, 20, 30 years later, when everybody thought, this mine is fine, we just close down, move someplace else, and then the problem shows up. And there's plenty of evidence across the US and the world around the damages of acid mine drainage, as they call it, as a result of high sulfide mining. And in fact, if you look at a literature review of a variety of publications, you find that really there's no hard rock surface mine in existence globally that can demonstrate that acid mine drainage can't be stopped once it occurs in large scale. So once you spread the sulfur around, it's dead meat for that particular territory. There's also literature that says that really there are no examples of a high sulfide mine in water-rich areas, which Tamarack and Minnesota boundary waters are. They're water-rich areas that do not pollute. So we know for sure that at least the history says that these sulfide mines, the proposed sulfide mines, will pollute. They'll pollute with sulfide-based impacts, which include acid mine drainage and the damage that causes. Now, just some examples of that kind of damage. The Summitville mine in Colorado has killed all biological life in a 17-mile stretch along the Alamoso River, where they were dumping tailings into the river. And that's going to be dead for, many, possibly 1,000 years before that can resolve itself. In fact, the EPA has spent over $210 million on cleanup. The Zortman-Landusky mine in north central Montana, similar situation. The mine went bankrupt around 1998, leaving the state of Montana with a huge liability for at least $33 million in long-term cleanup of that mine and reclamation as far as what they could do. Even more closer to home here in Houghton County in Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula, which is also known as Copper Country, there is now a big superfine site at Torch Lake. Torch Lake site varies. There are a number of different sites from 10 acres to over 200 acres that was contaminated due to copper mining activities from 1890s to 1969 when that closed. And that cleanup, that's a Superfund site as well. Cleanup and maintenance is ongoing. So plenty of examples, many of them nearby, of the damages of high sulfide mining. And I talked about the MPCA in the Birch Lake, and that's just from taconite, which is not considered a high sulfide mining operation, but there's enough sulfur in there, and they've done enough taconite mining. If you don't take care, the sulfides drain out sulfuric acid, and you have a lot of examples in the range where you have contamination due to sulfides and the associated acid mine drainage issues. Now, legislatively, one of the things that we're trying to do is to move forward in Minnesota, approve it first legislation. Not completely successful yet, but it's something that we encourage everyone to support. Now, Wisconsin had a prove it first law in place for about 20 years. And what the prove it first law essentially says is that you're not going to mine in this state unless you can prove that you're not going to pollute substantially by showing an example of an existing mine that hasn't polluted and that you've waited at least 10 years because sulfides tend to show themselves over time. Well, over that 20 years in Wisconsin, they couldn't actually find a sulfide mine. So Wisconsin being Wisconsin, that's why we're living in Minnesota, I guess. They just, well, we'll just repeal them. So that's what they did in 2017. But, you know, there's proof that the mining industry hasn't been able to create a mine in the world that has shown that it doesn't pollute. So they can't deny this. Now, another study, this is from 2006, they studied 25 operating hard rock mines and their EISs, their environmental statements. Now, all of them predicted compliance with water quality standards in their EIS. However, even though they predicted in the EIS, oh yeah, we'll be just fine, no problem, no pollution. In retrospect, 85% of those mines near surface water and 93% of the mines near groundwater exceeded water quality standards. So, you know, massive failure there. And 89% had inaccurately predicted that they would not create acid mine drainage. So just a high probability that in this case, the DNR said, oh yeah, this looks great. No, there shouldn't be any problem. We believe the mining companies, which are, you know, 90% wrong, usually. So we have to be, that, which is the other issue, is that Minnesota regulators, we've got a flyer on it by the booth there, but Minnesota regulators aren't necessarily interested in protecting the people or protecting the environment. They're most interested in creating jobs and satisfying the desires of mining companies because that creates a few jobs. Not very many jobs, mind you. I mean, in the range, it's a lot of jobs. Across Minnesota, it's like 0.4% or less. It's probably less than 0.4% of the jobs in Minnesota are related to mining. The 0.4% includes forestry. So in Minnesota, the mining number was so small, they had to combine it with other things in order to get it up above the threshold. So 0.4% of jobs is forestry and mining. So we're not talking about a lot of jobs, but we're talking about potentially large expenses for cleanup on these sulfide mines once the company goes bankrupt. And that's why they have like a little Talon leading the way, because they can go bankrupt. Rio Tinto isn't, and just leave like, whoops, we can't do any remediation because we went bankrupt. And we're from Canada anyway, so good luck. But you know, that's kind of the part of the game plan. Now, there's a lot of impacts from high sulfide mining, and this sheet kind of shows a whole set of them, but it includes just like, well, every health risk you can think of: cardiovascular, you know, heart blood clots, lung disease, etc., increased risk of dementia, all associated with the high sulfide mining particles that are spread across. We already talked about acid mine drainage, and we have talked about methyl mercury and all of that. But there's just a lot of problems, and these are documented. If you are interested in these references, you can get a copy of this presentation online. We can point you to the right place. So with that, let's talk a little bit about specifics, like, okay, who is Talon Metals? As I mentioned, the whole strategy for companies like Rio Tinto is create a little company, and Talon is just dedicated primarily on the Tamarack Talon mine. They were created for that purpose. They've started some drilling in in Michigan, but this is where they're spending all their money. And this is a really small two-bit company. Their stock is around 7 cents per share. 7 cents per share. Very high risk. They're not a US company. It's all based in Canada, but they're registered in the British Virgin Islands, incorporated. And they don't have a lot of money, so they could go bankrupt anytime. They're hoping to get an investor to keep the project going. But that's the game plan. Even if they get investors, it's all Talon, and then if Talon goes bankrupt or whatever, they're gone. And there's no one around to take responsibility for the ongoing mess that could be created. Now, the specific Talon Tamarack project is here. You can see 210. That's Cromwell, Wright, McGregor, and then Tamarack right in the middle. And the red area is the proposed mining area. But they have mineral leases on that whole dark gray area. And they believe they found pockets of nickel in that whole area. So when Alan says, they started with permitting in a small area and hoping to expand, that's another strategy. Normally, expansion by a mining company. Actually, I don't think that any taconite mine has ever had to do an EIS for expansion. They're trying to expand the big milepost 7 tailings pond, and they want to do that. We all said, well, you need that's a big lake, and your expansion is big. You should do an EIS, and the DNR decided not to. Like, well, why is that? Well, because they actually might find that it's polluting and damaging, and then the mining company can't do its thing. So there's a lot of ties there. Legislatively, that could be fixed as well. So right now, the DNR legally is not legally bound to protect the environment. DNR is a resource management division. So they're chartered to manage resources like permit mines and logging and things. They're not under legally required to protect people or the environment. And that could be fixed legislatively, but it's all of us that need to put pressure on legislators to do that. Now, the mine for the little small part is 8 million tons of ore over a 7 to 10 year period, which it likely would expand. And as Alan, or maybe it was Brett mentioned, there's a number of key issues. They've submitted a mine plan because they've started their environmental assessment process, like step 1. And they're blasting underground. So there's a lot of high sulfide dust, a lot of nitrogen oxide from the blasting materials. And they're venting that in the air, but there's no filters. So all of that is just going into the air. So it's like acid mine drainage 2.0 from coal. And they don't seem to be concerned about that. Now, in addition, and this is separate from the sulfide aspects, but just the environmental damages separate from sulfide in the area. Because it's such a wet area, they expect at least 2.3 million gallons of water to be pouring in from cracks and crevices because they're right underneath aquifers. Well, they have to pump that out. And since it's mixing with the ore and the dust, it's dirty. So they said, oh, well, we'll filter it with reverse osmosis. Well, what do you do with that 2.3 million gallons of water a day without flooding something? And you're going to drop sterile water into the environment, which is not good, for the aquatic life. And it may be quite a bit more than 2.3 million gallons because they didn't take into account. They just put some drill holes and measured water fill based on drill holes back in prior to 2020. But they're blasting every day. Not blasting is going to cause cracks and fissures in the bedrock to increase because they're not that low. They're maybe only 300 foot above surface down to maybe 1,200 feet down. So they're not that high. Anyways, they're close to the surface. And that could cause quite a bit more water. So now the problem is, well, they built processing for 2.3 million gallons. They're getting 5 million gallons. What do they do with the extra? Well, they'll send a little note to the DNR and say, there's nothing we can do. You just have to dump it and it won't be a problem. Well, yeah, right. Because the DNR won't stop. I mean, the DNR has never stopped major mining operations. If you remember Silver Bay dumping all the tailings in the Lake Superior, it wasn't the DNR or the MPCA that did anything. It was the EPA that the federal government do for 10 years to get them to stop doing that. The DNR went and hid in their holes along with the MPCA, like, we're not going to do it. So you can't really count on these agencies with their legislative mandate to actually protect us, which is sad, of course. Now, at first, Talon was going to build a huge tailings pile that they were just going to cover and say, oh, don't worry about it. And we complained enough, and even supporters of the mine in the local governments didn't like that idea. So Talon changed their mind and shipped it all to North Dakota, where they plan to process it in North Dakota in an already brownfield site that's already environmentally damaged. They figure, well, we can damage it further because it's already damaged. So they actually haven't done anything there. They haven't purchased any land or anything. Kind of a story right now. We don't know if it's actually true, but even the rail transport to get all the raw ore out to North Carolina, the rail transport, those cars leak dust. They have leak holes so that when it rains, that the water can seep out, and it will seep out acidic, sulfide acid stuff along the track. And in the winter, the problem is, well, it's a wet mine, right? 2.3 million gallons. So you take all this wet ore, you stick it in an ice cube tray and ship it across, and it freezes when it gets to the other end. And what do you do about that? Maybe more chemicals to keep it from freezing in the car. So, not a really good plan from an environmental perspective or from a project. Now, that's not the only one, and you may not have heard of this one, Greenbridge. So Greenbridge just in February announced that they got rights to start exploring just north of Duluth. So in the map, there's Duluth down there, and there's a whole north contact zone, south contact. Well, north of Duluth, south of some of the range and boundary waters, that they'll be exploring for high sulfide minerals, nickel and copper and things like that. And the southern part of that is only maybe 15 miles away from them. But they'll be drilling holes. And now the concentrations that they've talked about when you read the detail are such that this has to be probably an open pit mine to be successful. Because when you go underground, it's a lot more expensive. You need probably at least 2% nickel to be economically viable. When it's on the surface, they can do open pit. You can go down to quite low, even 0.2% nickel and make it profitable. So you might be facing a huge open pit, high sulfide mine. Where do you put the tailings there? What do you do with all the sulfide? Starting only 15 miles, north of Duluth, if that continues. So that's something we need to watch. It's going to be a number of years away because they just got the property rights, and then they're going to apply for permits for drilling. They're going to drill a ton of holes using PFAS to lubricate the drills. Another problem, we're concerned about PFAS, and create the necessary documents to get the ball rolling relative to mining up there. Yeah, the question is, do they have to buy the land? And they don't have to buy well, it depends on what kind of mining they're doing. In the Tamarack area, they just have to buy the land where they have the surface facility. And they have the mineral rights, because Minnesota is happy to give mineral rights to mining companies and not to individuals. And most individuals, the mineral rights that they used to have were taken away. So like in Tamarack, they can go down and then go out underneath people's property because they have the mineral rights to do that. If they do an open pit mine, they likely have to buy it. And I'm not sure what's up there, if there's anything up there. But you know, that'll be an issue too if it comes close to that in future years. Any other questions? It is the Summitville mine in Colorado. Thanks. Afterwards. Yeah, it is. It is insane. And first, the mining companies have a rationale for why they want to mine. Of course, it's a foreign company, so it's easy for them. Now, saying it's a foreign company, they also in Canada have gone north and clear cut and have done strip mining, huge amounts of copper and nickel are in northern Toronto, northern Quebec, and other Ontario, mostly Ontario. So they're not kind to their own country either. And those are usually only populated by native populations, Crow and Ojibwe. That's not good. Now, it's all about, for the mining company, it's all about money and making a profit. I mean, really, that's it. They will make all kinds of excuses. And I provided some of the excuses here because you probably heard them. Like one of the recent ones is, oh, shouldn't we mine nickel here because there are poor labor practices in Indonesia? Like, well, first, why does that make any sense? But some people say, oh, that makes perfect sense. Except if you look at the details, it still makes no sense. In that, first of all, we don't import nickel from Indonesia. All the Indonesian nickel is really bought up by China, and it goes to China. And it goes typically for stainless steel, not batteries. The Talon marketing line is, oh, we're mining the nickel in Tamarack for EV batteries for the green revolution, so we're good guys. Well, and I'll talk about that. That's not so good either. But so none of the Indonesian nickel, excuse me, ends up in normal U.S. supply chain. You can see from the slide, we get our nickel from Canada, Norway, Finland, even Russia, but no Indonesia on those. We get a lot of recycled stainless steel from Canada, Mexico, the UK, and some Russia. So we don't get our nickel from Indonesia. That goes to Canada. And interestingly, is most of the Indonesian ores, it's in lateralites, which is an iron-based ores. So they're not doing high-sulfide mining predominantly, some probably, but not predominantly in Indonesia. And what China has done cleverly is they've created blast furnaces where you can drop these, because the iron content is so high, they can drop the ore directly into the blast furnace and make stainless steel out of it and steel products. And it's very cost effective. Indonesia isn't that far from China, so this was great for China. And so they opportunistically bought all that up. But frankly, all that Indonesian nickel, it most likely goes to China and gets incorporated into stainless steel that we may use or may not, because we won't have any idea. But it doesn't have anything to do with EV batteries and Talon. And the EV thing is also used for copper, for the Glencoe and all that. Oh, we need all this, and similar arguments. But Talon nickel actually would have no effect on the market. Indonesian nickel is about 50% of the worldwide nickel mine. Now it's 25% of the nickel used because we actually recycle a lot of nickel. In the US, it's something like 57% or some 47%. Some large number, and that's good. Because mining is fundamentally unsustainable. So we have to recycle. If there's any takeaway, recycle. And it doesn't need to be like all these little detailed things. If we could just recycle everything that had a motor above some threshold, like 4 horsepower, and recycle all lithium batteries, just do those 2 things, we potentially could mostly solve it. But we don't, but we should. And that's not that hard to do.
My question is, sulfur doesn't seem to be usable or exportable itself as primarily side effect of mining heavy metals like nickel. Is that correct?
Sulfur is, well, it is used like in fertilizers, and there's some various aspects of matches. You know, there are uses of some, but sulfur is so available in the environment that you can buy sulfur for about $60 a ton. Now, if you want to buy nickel, a ton of nickel, it's going to cost you maybe $18,000. $60, $18,000. At $60 a ton, that's the cheapest thing you can buy. It's like cheaper than dirt. You know, you go to your dirt because you want a ton of topsoil in your yard. It's going to be more than $60. Yes, yeah, gunpowder and things. Yeah, so there's a lot of uses for sulfur, but it's so available that the price is so low. It's hard to recover it and say, well, I'm going to recover the sulfur and sell it.